Before we begin, let us ease into the stillness. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? Leave it gently in the comments below. And if this kind of calm, historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing. It helps keep the fire lit night after night. Now settle back, let the world outside go quiet. Let the hum of your room fade into nothing. Because tonight, we drift far from the glow of modern clocks and into a world lit only by flame, where the night was longer, the sleep was stranger, and rest was a ritual far more peculiar than you might imagine. This is not a story of kings or queens, not of wars or scrolls or grand declarations. It is a story of beds, of dreams, of creaking rafters and candle shadows. It is the story of how people once slept, when the dark was thicker, the cold was deeper, and the night was divided. Let's begin in a quiet hamlet in England, late in the 14th century. There is no clock on the wall, no hour to announce bedtime. Instead, the church bell marks the rhythm of life, and the bell has just tolled for Compline. The final prayer of the day. It is dark now, fully, utterly, the kind of darkness that settles into your lungs. The cottage is made of wattle and daub, walls that breathe in the wind and let spiders live rent-free in the corners. The hearth glows low, the fire just embers now. A mother, her hands cracked from washing, her apron dusted in flour, calls softly to her children. Time for bed. But not the bed you imagine. There are no thick mattresses, no springs, just straw, sometimes stuffed into a linen sack if they were lucky, more often laid bare on wooden planks or atop coarse cloth. One child curls under a sheepskin, another shares a blanket with the family dog who sleeps right beside them for warmth. The parents, they sleep sitting upright against the wall. Why? Because lying flat was thought to invite death. It was how the dead were laid out for burial. So many medieval people slept propped on pillows or angled boards, believing it kept their souls from slipping away while they dreamed. Let that image soften now, a family drifting to sleep in uneven silence, not all at once, not for the night, because here's where it gets strange. They aren't expecting to sleep all the way through, not even close. You see, in medieval Europe, and especially in the colder months, segmented sleep was common. They called it first sleep and second sleep. The first began shortly after dusk, roughly from 8 p.m. to midnight, 4 hours of deep, uninterrupted rest. Then, they would wake up, for an hour or more quietly, naturally. It wasn't considered strange, it was expected. People used this time, often called the watch, to stoke the fire, say prayers, think, even visit neighbors, yes, in the middle of the night. Some would write, sew, or read scripture by candlelight if they were literate. Others simply lay still, not sleeping, but not truly awake either. A liminal hour, a pocket of time that belonged to no one but the self, and then, gently without pressure, they'd fall back into their second sleep, from roughly 1 or 2 a.m. until sunrise. This rhythm wasn't seen as broken. It was natural, the modern idea of a full 8 hours unbroken in a single stretch. That is modern, industrial, artificial. In the medieval mind, sleep had its own seasons, just like the crops. Let that dual sleep rhythm wrap around you now. Soft, measured, like the turning of a wheel. Of course, not everyone slept peacefully. Especially, not the poor or the sick or the lonely. In many homes, people shared beds, not just families, but even strangers at inns. If you couldn't afford your own room, you might share a mattress with 2 or 3 other travelers. No privacy. just the shuffle of limbs and the occasional snore. And then there were the watchmen, those who didn't sleep at night at all. Their job was to walk the streets, slowly, deliberately, with lantern and staff, calling out the hour and anything amiss. The bell has struck 1 and all is well. They were the heartbeat of the sleeping city, and when something was not well, they knocked on doors, woke healers, sounded alarms, but more often they simply walked, watched, guarded the sleep of those who slept in fits and fragments. And what of dreams? Our dreams. To a medieval mind, dreams were messages, from God, from devils, from your own soul. They were not dismissed, they were feared, recorded, prayed over. If a woman dreamed of a snake coiling at her feet, she might wake and sprinkle salt around the doorway. If a man dreamed of drowning, he might fast the next day or seek counsel. There were dream books, guides to interpreting symbols. A white dove meant hope, a black dog meant betrayal. To dream of teeth falling out, a death in the family, and yet in their own way these beliefs were comforting. They made the night meaningful. Sleep was not wasted time. It was sacred, unstable, alive. Even the act of sleeping in a church was practiced. During plague times, or in bouts of mass hysteria, entire villages would sleep on the floors of cathedrals, not just for protection, but to invite divine dreams. To sleep in the shadow of the altar was to ask for insight, forgiveness, maybe even a miracle. But not every sleep was blessed. There were sleep demons, the most infamous, the incubus and succubus, male and female spirits who visited sleepers in the night, to torment, to seduce, to suffocate. What we might now call sleep paralysis. Back then, it was a visit from something you couldn't see. People placed iron under their beds to ward them off, hung herbs above the door, marked the bedposts with holy signs. Sleep was never just sleep. It was battle. It was ritual. It was survival. Now let us return, slowly, to the cottage in the hamlet. The fire has gone completely cold. A rooster crows faintly in the distance. The children stir. The mother rubs her eyes. Not from a full night's rest, but from a long enough one. Time to rise. To start again. To carry water. To prepare bread. To wait for first sleep to come again. And you, let this strangeness lull you. Let the image of segmented sleep soften your breath. First sleep. Watch. Second sleep. Not wrong, just different, just forgotten. And perhaps, as you drift tonight, you'll wake in the quiet hours and remember, you are not alone. The medieval world slept like this for centuries, and still, in some corners of the world, it does. The cold stones of a monastery floor held more stories than most books. In the early hours, when the wind crawled through the cracks in the walls and the bells had not yet stirred, a monk named for no record would wake from his first sleep not with panic, but with a practiced sigh. He did not wake in a rush, for there was nothing new to wake to. Just the silence between the bells and the breath of his own lungs in the still dark. He would move silently, careful not to disturb his brothers. His bare feet knew the path. 12 slow steps to the small wooden bench near the candle niche. The wax was cold, the wick blackened. He'd strike a spark with flint and steel, not with haste, but with slow rhythm, each strike more a prayer than an action. The wick would catch, the flame would rise, and he would sit. This was not insomnia, not disorder. This was his watch. Outside, the wind murmured like an old priest reciting half-remembered scripture. The monastery was still, but not entirely asleep. There were always some who rose during the watch hours, monks who prayed in whispers, others who copied texts by trembling flame. Some simply sat, letting the silence press against their chest, until they felt small enough to vanish, then large enough to forgive themselves for not vanishing. In the medieval world, to wake in the middle of the night was not a failure of rest, but an opening. Perchance, the line between sleep and consciousness was not as sharp as it is now. It was a shallow stream to step through and back again, and so, during those deep hours, past midnight but before dawn, many wandered in thought. Some wandered in scripture. Some wandered through the folds of their own fears, like fingering old fabric. In farm cottages, women would often use this time to weave by low flame, their fingers steady, movements memorized. The world around them hushed. The dog curled near. The coals. The baby's breathing soft behind her shoulder, and in that rhythmic quiet she would think not of tomorrow but of what had passed. Who had not returned? What had spoiled? What had been hidden in the bread box that morning, and whether it was truly her imagination? It was during the night watch that secrets lived longest. A man might sit with a letter he could not read. A girl might stare into the dark corner of a room she was certain had whispered her name. A servant might lie awake, eyes open, memorizing the sound of the master's shoes, just in case they approached her bed again. These were not hours of sleep. They were hours of presence, and for those who had no candles, they lay awake in the dark and listened to rats, to rain, to the sound of the roof settling, like the house itself had bones and breath. To be poor and wake during the watch was to encounter darkness as a physical thing. It had weight, texture. It smelled of smoke, of damp straw, of unwashed feet and boiled onions. It filled the nose and sat in the mouth like oil, and yet it was familiar, intimate, like an old shawl you didn't like but needed. The wealthy fared differently. Those with coin and class had heavier blankets and thicker doors, and sometimes even servants to wake them if a dream needed decoding. Their beds were higher, literal status symbols, raised off the ground to avoid fleas and the chill. Some were so large they required small steps to mount. Couples often slept apart, even when married. Separate rooms, separate warmth, separate dreams. And yet even they adhered to the rhythm. First sleep, wake, second sleep. What they did during the wake differed. They might pace the gallery, read poetry, sip warmed wine thickened with herbs to coax the second sleep gently. Some turned to matters of the flesh. The medieval watch hour was considered, in some texts, the best time for intimacy, because the body was rested and the world was silent, and no one would interrupt. A monk might preach against such use of the hours. A merchant might write it in his diary. A woman, afterwards, might lie with her eyes open and wonder why the second sleep never came. In towns and cities, the watch hour meant other things. Candle makers, their sleep always brief, might use the time to trim wicks, mix tallow, stir beeswax over the fire. The baker's apprentice would rise before all else to coax the coals back to life, shaping dough in the quiet, the sound of kneading, the only reminder that morning was still far off. For some, the night was work, not rest. Nightmen, those who cleared human waste from chamber pots and cesspits, did their rounds then, cloaked in stink, paid in shame. No one thanked them. They were the ghosts of the city, and yet they worked while others drifted. In the upper floors of narrow buildings, old women whispered rosaries. Midwives dozed sitting up, always waiting for the rap on the door. And in the forest edges, hunters and poachers crept silently beneath moonlight, risking more than a fine if caught, and somewhere, always somewhere, someone was dying. Not with drama, not loudly, but in the way most people did then, slowly, without announcement, surrounded by sleep. The family might rise during the watch and check the breath, hold the hand, say nothing, and return to bed, knowing that the second sleep would be their last together. Sleep was not separate from life. It was threaded through it, and for those who could not afford beds at all, the vagrants, the pilgrims, the poor, sleep came in doorways, in haylofts, on cloister steps, interrupted, fitful, and yet claimed like a small act of rebellion against the cold. Let that linger for a while. 1,000 sleepers sprawled across 1,000 places, each one clinging to their own version of the night, each one surrendering, resisting, surviving, with nothing but blankets and breath. They did not count hours. They counted warmth. They counted the times they turned over. They counted the scratches on the walls, the sound of cats in the alley, the dreams that returned. And the dreams that didn't. Even in castles, sleep was never guaranteed. Stone walls are poor at keeping out drafts or nightmares. Guards patrolled the halls, torches smoked in sconces, and the princess in the tower. She often slept beside a maid or a dog, or alone if her behavior had displeased her mother. Even the nobility feared the things that crept through dreams. And those who believed in curses, which was most, kept charms beneath their pillows. Fennel. Seeds, amulets, tiny scrolls written by monks who charged too much. To sleep deeply in the medieval world was a gift, one often denied. The sleep-deprived were not pitied, they were ignored, because sleep, like food, was a matter of place and coin. If you were lucky, you got both. If not one, you made do, or you suffered quietly. Let that rest now in your chest, the knowing that sleep was not always easy, that for hundreds of years it came in pieces, in fragments, in pockets of time stolen from hunger, fear, and labor. And yet people endured. They dreamed, even when they didn't remember how. And when the bells rang again, for matins or prime, they rose. Not refreshed, not always whole, but risen. And so the day began. In some corners of medieval Europe, night did not fall gently. It arrived like a wave, fast, loud, heavy. It swallowed the colors of the world. The fields turned to ink, the faces of loved ones blurred like fading memories. The only thing that remained was sound, the distant hoot of an owl, the shifting of wood beams, the flick of flame from a lantern struggling against the dark. And in that blackness, sleep was not always expected. In villages nestled deep in wooded valleys, where even the moonlight struggled to reach the ground, people developed rituals to invite sleep, not in comfort but in caution. They believed the night belonged to other things, spirits, saints, the unquiet dead. So before sleep they would lock the doors, not just with latches, but with spoken charms. They would whisper to the beams, as if the house itself were listening, and they believed it was. They would sweep the hearth clean and scatter salt in a circle at the foot of the bed. Some would leave a cup of milk for the restless souls who might pass by, not to welcome them, but to appease them. To sleep without these acts was unwise. It was to invite visitation, and while few would admit to believing in ghosts, almost none would risk it. Children were taught young. Never go to bed angry. Never sleep with your feet facing the door, and never, ever whistle after sundown. The fear of what the dark could bring was greater than the desire to rest, so sleep had to be earned, prepared, almost negotiated, and once the family finally settled, sleep would come in layers. There was the initial dozing, the slipping, light, and tentative, as if the soul were testing the water, then deeper and but never fully gone, because someone always stayed half awake, the oldest daughter perhaps, who was taught to rise at any cough or creak. Or the grandmother, who never slept more than an hour at a time, or the father whose ears stayed tuned to the movements of wolves in the distance, or the groan of a fence disturbed. Even in sleep, the medieval home listened. It was not uncommon for sleepers to speak out loud mid-dream, and dreams were not considered private. In the morning, families often recounted what they saw: a cow dying in the snow, an omen, a ladder breaking, a sign, a flood in the kitchen. Bad luck for the harvest. The line between dream and prophecy was fragile, and so dreams were shared like bread, passed hand to hand across the breakfast table, studied, debated, feared. Some villages even kept a dream interpreter, usually an older woman, not a healer, but someone who had lived long enough to have seen dreams come true or fall apart. She would sit with the dreamer, ask quiet questions, look at the moon's phase, and decide whether it was simply the stew from last night or something more. In abbeys and monasteries, sleep followed strict rules. The monks slept in long rows, dormitories, sometimes dozens in a hall. Each bed was simple: a wooden frame, a straw mattress, one coarse wool blanket. Pillows were rare, comfort discouraged. The idea was not to drift into indulgence, but to rest just enough to continue God's work. Monks were awakened at regular intervals through the night for prayers. Matins. Lords. The night was interrupted by design, and this was not cruelty, it was devotion. Sleep was surrendered, bit by bit like coin to a poor box, and they believed the sacrifice brought them closer to the divine. But not all monks followed the rules. Some dozed longer than allowed. Some never truly slept at all, their minds filled with doubts and memories. They could not pray away. And some wrote secretly by moonlight, journals not meant for the church but for themselves. One such monk in a crumbling abbey near the Welsh border once wrote, "I woke again before Lord's. The frost has crept beneath the doors. I dreamed of my mother's kitchen, the sound of onions frying. I have not eaten them in 20 years. I think my soul is hungrier than my stomach." In those quiet hours, sleep and hunger and longing blurred together. Out in the wild lands, far from town bells and monastery gongs, shepherds kept night watch with their flocks. They slept sitting up, arms crossed over their chests, the dogs curled at their feet, the stars above like scattered candle wax. They did not dream deeply. Their sleep was like a rope, slack but ready to pull taut at the sound of hooves or a lamb crying out. These were the lightest sleepers of all, because one mistake could mean loss, not just of sheep but of food, of coin, of the small, hard-earned things that kept life going through the winter. In ports and seaside towns, fishermen had their own rituals. Before sleep, they would scrub their hands with sand, not just to clean, but to erase the scent of the sea. They believed, if the sea smelled you, it would call you back before you were ready. Some wrapped their nets at the foot of the bed, a kind of offering, a bargain. Take the net, not the man. Their dreams were full of water, not always storms. Sometimes just endless waves, no shore, no sky, only drifting. And when they woke, they often couldn't remember if they were awake or simply in the next layer of the dream. Because sleep at sea, even on land, never quite let go of its salt. In castles, things were stranger still. Royalty often slept at odd hours. kept awake by candlelit feasts, political meetings, and the strange tides of aristocratic boredom. Some kings were nocturnal, preferring to walk the halls at night. Whispers tell of one queen who refused to sleep in the same room more than twice in a row, fearing that spirits could find her if she stayed still too long. She would move from chamber to chamber, dragging her linens, her maids, her cat. Each room had a charm carved. In the doorframe, each pillowcase was sprinkled with lavender and crushed cloves. And still, she rarely slept before dawn because fear does not bow to crown or coin, and the dark does not care for titles. Let your mind wander now, to the endless sleeping places of the medieval world, to the pallets in barns, the hammocks on ships, the cloisters under churches, the benches in taverns, the forest clearings, the hay carts, the bare earth. The warmth of sleep didn't come from the bed. It came from the ritual, the habit, the belief that even a moment of rest could soften the edge of living. It is a strange truth that the quietest people often lived in the noisiest places, and in medieval towns, thick with life, thick with smells, thick with the cluttered breathing of bodies packed too close. Sleep had to be negotiated with noise, not sought in silence. There were towns where the streets never truly slept, not in the way the countryside did, blanketed by trees and sky and owls. Here in the tangle of timbered buildings and crooked lanes, even the shadows whispered. People didn't sleep through the night in these towns. They took sleep in turns, as though it were a shared cup. The baker woke before midnight. The watchman dozed before dawn. Prostitutes and poets alike worked the hours when everyone else pretended to be asleep. And above them all, the cats, those silent observers, slipped across the rafters and the rooftops, pawing at thatched straw and mouse. Bones chasing dreams of their own. The poorer you were, the more people you slept beside. Beds were shared, not out of affection but necessity. 1 mattress, 5 bodies. An old woman, a child, a cousin recently widowed, a boy who wouldn't stop coughing, and someone's visiting brother. You learn to sleep within others, not beside them. The rhythm of their breath became the rhythm of your dreams. Their turning woke you, their warmth held you, and if someone got up, just for a moment, to stoke the coals or fetch a jug or relieve themselves outside, then the whole row might shuffle. And sleep, that fragile truce between you and the night, would break and need to be rebuilt again, breath by breath. Privacy didn't exist. Not for dreams, not for thoughts, not for sorrow. People slept like pages in a book, pressed together, thin and worn, their stories overlapping, and if someone moaned in their sleep, it was not polite to ask. Sleep was considered sacred, yes, but it was also something to be survived. In the coldest months, people would speak of the dead rising to sleep beside the living, souls seeking warmth. A cousin, recently lost to fever, might be felt slipping beneath the blanket. No one screamed. No one panicked. They just whispered a prayer and tried not to breathe too loudly. Because in the medieval imagination, sleep was a place you could be visited. Not just by dreams or memories, but by others. The dead, the divine, the damned. Some believe that nightmares were not simply the product of stress or sickness, but literal attacks. A mare, a spirit or demon, was said to sit upon the chest of sleepers, pressing the air from their lungs, making them paralyzed, their mouths silent, their hearts racing like drums. They called it the nightmare, and it was not metaphor to them, it was real. And if you had one, you told no one, lest they too be followed. To prevent such visits, people tied iron keys beneath their pillows. They stitched herbs into their bed linens, mugwort, wormwood, valerian. Some carved crosses into the underside of their beds. Others slept with their faces covered entirely, believing the spirit couldn't see what it couldn't name. And if sleep still would not come, they did not count sheep. They recited prayers, or for the less religious, memories of meals, of voices, of fields walked in summer, of bread shared with friends who had since vanished. Sleep came more easily to those who remembered kindness. But what of the ones who couldn't? What of the cruel, the angry, the sleepless? They often roamed the streets. There were names for them: moon haunters, lamp skulks, dark walkers. They were said to be cursed, compelled to walk at night until their sins were burned away by the cold. In truth, many of them were simply lonely, men who had lost everything, women driven out, the mad, the maimed, those the world no longer knew what to do with. They drifted between doors and alleys, mumbling half prayers and half curses, leaving behind only muddy footprints and confusion. And so sleep became a shelter, not just from fatigue, but from the night itself. It was armor. Those who had it were envied. Those who couldn't find it were feared. And for children, sleep came differently still. They were told stories, not just to amuse them, but to protect them. Tales of creatures who would steal them away if they didn't sleep. The night hag, the sleep taker, the silent man. With eyes like coins, these weren't gentle lullabies, they were warnings. But within that fear was also a strange kind of comfort. Because every child knew the truth. Monsters wouldn't come if you were already dreaming, so they tried to sleep fast, to outrun the dark. In wealthier homes, sleep was arranged with ceremony. The bedding was turned by servants, coals placed beneath, the mattress to warm the frame, linen sprayed with rosewater or vinegar, curtains pulled tight to keep out draughts and prying eyes. Some lords had entire sleep chambers separate from their bedrooms. Quiet, dark, windowless, a place not to live but to withdraw. They took sleep seriously because they could afford to, and still many found it elusive because sleep is no respecter of status. It slips in where it will, and sometimes does not come at all. Those who studied the stars believed that sleep cycles were written in the heavens, that certain alignments made sleep easier, that Mercury disturbed dreams, that Mars brought troubled rest. That sleepwalking was not madness, but evidence of the soul walking among the stars, leaving the body behind. And those who suffered from strange dreams, visions, speaking in tongues, laughter, or crying in the night, were sometimes brought to healers, not always to be cured, but to be understood. Because in the medieval world, strange sleep could mean many things: possession, prophecy, poetry. Some were feared, some were revered, and some were simply left alone. Let that thought settle now. Sleep, in its many forms, was a world unto itself, a second life lived between dusk and dawn, filled with visitors, filled with rules, and yet always slightly out of reach, even for those who most needed it. Even for those who had done everything right. The beds swept, the candles snuffed, the prayers said, the herbs hung, the charms kissed, still. The eyes remained open, and so they waited. Waited for the body to soften, waited for the breath to deepen, waited for the moment when the weight of the world lifted, just enough to allow them to slip beneath it and vanish for a while. You can. Feel it now, can't you? The way sleep clung to people back then. Not like a blanket, but like a memory trying not to be forgotten. A gentle hush settling over the skin, a quiet sigh from the wood of the floor, a slow blink. And then, nothing. Just the sound of your own heart fading into stillness. Sleep had rhythms in the medieval world. Not schedules, not science, but rhythms. Long meandering inherited patterns passed down, not through books, but through bodies. A grandmother might sleep in 2 shifts. A child might sleep in 3 naps. A knight might sleep standing. A priest might not sleep at all. And no one questioned why, because that was simply how it had always been. In many places, especially before artificial light changed everything, sleep was naturally segmented. People fell asleep soon after sunset, when candles ran low, when hearths dimmed, when eyes ached from the day's dust. And then, some hours later, they would wake, quietly, calmly, without alarm or confusion. This was called the first sleep. It lasted from dusk to around midnight, deep, still, animal-like in its necessity. Then a wakeful hour, a space in the dark. The fee, time between sleeps. People used this hour gently. They did not light torches or startle the house. They sat, they whispered, they prayed. They even visited neighbors. Some wrote in journals. Some lay in silence, reflecting on dreams. Some made love, not in urgency, but in rhythm, as if this moment between sleeps was the only time their souls were both fully present. Afterward came the second sleep, lighter, more dream-filled, often filled with strange imagery and sounds that blurred into morning. Doctors of the day even recommended it. Manuals and letters mention the benefits of a first and second sleep, especially for digestion and clarity of thought. It was not strange to them. It was natural, expected, like breathing in 2 parts. And for those who lived, alone, hermits, shepherds, widows, the rhythm was even more fluid. They might drift in and out of sleep many times in the night, their dreams weaving in and out of waking life like thin scarves floating in wind. Time moved differently in the night. Even the clocks knew this, because most towns did not have bells. For midnight, they rang for matins, the early prayer, and lauds, the first light. But midnight, that was a space without sound, a space between worlds. So silence meant not to be broken, but not everyone honored the quiet. Some worked. The millers, for instance, those who ran the grain mills outside towns, often preferred to run them at night. Not because it was easier, but because it was safer. Less risk of theft, fewer complaints about noise. The night wrapped around the grinding stone like a shawl, and the mill turned slowly, a deep hum that rocked the sleeping countryside like a lullaby made of stone and flour. The smell of fresh ground wheat would sometimes carry on the breeze, and those who lay awake would smell it and feel comforted, even if they had no bread. It reminded them that someone somewhere was awake, that the world still moved. Sleep is lighter when you know you're not the only one left behind in the dark. There were also the sick rooms, small spaces often attached to churches or abbeys, where the poor or dying were brought to pass the night. Not for healing, there were few cures, but for presence, someone to watch, someone to hold a hand. The infirmaries were warm, not from fire, but from bodies. Too many bodies, and the air was thick with coughs, prayers, and the smell of rosemary burned to cover the rot. Sleep in these rooms came with a cost. Those who watched often slept sitting up, heads slumped against the wall, a rosary still tangled in their fingers. And when the sick did sleep, it was shallow, mottled, interrupted by fever and pain. But still, they dreamed. They dreamed of green things, of rivers and apples and bread that never grew stale, and the nurses whispered that this meant the end was near. The sweetest dreams came just before death, and so they let them sleep. Elsewhere, in the night, in the narrow stone rooms of towers and keeps, the scribes worked. Monks and lay clerks, those trained in letters, often found the night-time best for copying texts. The light was difficult, yes, but the silence was better. No footsteps, no questions, no sounds from the stable or kitchens, just the scratch of quill on parchment and the slow fading of candlelight. They would pause between pages to rub their eyes. Sometimes they would doze, mid-word, their pen leaving a jagged trail across the calfskin page. These marks were never erased. They remained, proof that even scripture bowed to sleep, and the books they made carried these dreams forward. The gentle errors, the strange doodles in the margins, the letters drawn with shaky hands, these were not mistakes. These were the fingerprints of sleep upon the written word. Elsewhere in the villages, in the highlands and the moors, people spoke of dream walkers, those who moved in sleep. Not always in bed, not always inside, but outside and wandering. There are stories of women found in fields, standing barefoot, arms outstretched to the sky, eyes closed, lips moving, speaking in languages they didn't know. Of boys curled up, in church pews, mouths open in silent laughter, dreaming of feasts that had never happened, of men who walked into rivers not to die, but to return to something they had forgotten. These stories were not mocked, they were recorded and feared. Because dreamwalkers were thought to be touched, not mad, not sick, but half in, half out, carriers of something older than the mind, and those who touched them as they slept, who tried to stop their journey, were said to go blind. So people left them be, and when they woke, no one asked what they had seen, because some things should remain in the dream. Even now, if you walk certain paths in old villages, there are stones marked with shallow hollows, places where the dream walkers once sat. You may not see them, but someone did, and someone remembered. Let your breath soften now. Let your body go slack. Let the weight of these memories settle into your bones like dust on an old floor. You're not meant to follow every thread. You're just meant to drift like they did, like the baker who rose too early, the scribe who fell asleep mid-word, the widow who whispered into the dark for her husband long gone, the sick who dreamed of apples, the monk who forgot his prayer and wept instead. They all drifted in their own ways towards sleep. In the folds of medieval night, where silence met smoke and shadows wore familiar shapes, sleep was not a luxury. It was a negotiation, and in some places, a performance. There were households, particularly among the superstitious or aristocratic, where sleep required ritual. Not simple prayer or candle snuffing, but elaborate sleep ceremonies passed down as family tradition. These routines, though strange to modern minds, gave comfort to those who followed them, like drawing circles around oneself in the dark. One family in France, for instance, believed no sleep could begin unless the eldest child rang a brass bell 3 times above the hearth. No one remembered why, but it was done, always, even in famine, even in plague, even when only one remained. Others swore by sense. In noble homes, linen soaked in vinegar of the four thieves, a mixture of herbs once believed to ward off the Black Death, was stuffed beneath mattresses or burned in braziers. The sharpness filled the room like a ghost. Some claimed it cleared the head. Others said it brought dreams filled with warnings, prophecies, long-dead relatives whispering from corners, and still there were those who refused scent entirely. For some households, anything other than the smell of firewood and sweat was considered provocative, even sinful, especially in monasteries. Monks slept in rows, heads shaved, breath measured, bodies still. Talking was forbidden. Snoring was endured. Dreams were not discussed, but not all religious people avoided dreams. There were mystics, holy women, and anchorites who believed that dreams were sacred visits. They trained themselves to dream vividly, to record what they saw, to describe the angels, the colors, the music. Some claimed to dream in Latin, a language they did not know by day. One mystic, Hildegard, spoke of dream sleep as a curtain that lifts only when the mind is unburdened. She described falling asleep not as a descent, but as an ascent, climbing into a divine realm, away from the weight of the world. Her sleep chamber was simple: a wooden cell, a narrow cot, a single candle. But before she lay down, she would chant softly, not to call sleep, but to announce herself to the other world. And if no dream came, she wept, because to her dreamlessness was not peace, it was exile. Other mystics told different stories, of dreams filled with fire, of judgment, of entire villages burning while their residents slept unaware. They were not believed, but they were feared, and so sleep for these people became not a place of rest, but a threshold, a trial, a test of faith. But what of those who lived far from churches, far from towns, in the highlands, in the marshes, in the tangled forests of northern Europe? How did they sleep? In layers. Literally and figuratively, peasants who lived in cold regions slept in layers of clothing, sometimes up to 6 or 7. Wool, leather, linen, even straw stuffed into sleeves. They piled on what they had, not because it was comfortable, but because it was survival. Cold was not romantic. It was a constant companion, one that could kill silently in the night. Children were often tucked beneath parents. Chickens were brought indoors. Sometimes pigs too, not for warmth alone, but for the rhythm of their breath. The steady snorts and grunts reminded people they weren't alone, that life was still close. In many cases, families would sleep around the fire rather than in beds. Beds were for the few, the wealthy, the married, the sick, for everyone. Hell's sleep came on the ground, and when there was no ground, sleep came where it must, on carts, in fields, atop hay, in church pews. One chronicle from 1298 describes a woman who gave birth in the night while sleeping beside a sheep pen. She did not wake until morning. The child was already crying. The midwife simply said, "She dreamed him." And everyone nodded, because in a world where sleep blurred with magic and faith and biology, why not? Why shouldn't a child be dreamed into the world? In other parts of Europe, particularly in Slavic regions, it was believed that sleep had to be invited. You could not simply close your eyes. You had to call it, with a rhyme, a phrase, a bit of lullaby muttered half aloud into the straw. If you didn't, the wrong thing might come, something pretending to be sleep, a shadow that settles behind your eyelids, but never lets you truly rest. Children were taught the rhyme early. "Sleep, sweet sleep, come eat my dreams. Leave me bones and silent seams." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone used it, because the alternative was waking with a scream and a heart full of fear and no memory of why. And what of the sick? We return to them, because they too had their own strange sleep. People with fever slept with onions beneath their arms, or garlic braided into their hair. It was thought these drew out poison. Others lay with plates of iron on their chests to trap the heat. Still others were wrapped in wet cloth tightly until sleep came from sheer exhaustion. Healers sometimes whispered to the sick as they slept, not to comfort them but to influence their dreams, to pull them, like ropes, through fog back into the land of the living. If they twitched, it meant the rope held. If they were still, it meant it had snapped, and the healer would weep, but not loudly, Sleep was not to be disturbed, not even then. Let this part settle around you like dust on worn stone. You're not meant to remember it all, just to let it pass over you, like mist, in a field, like fog rolling through a ruined chapel, like dreams in a house with too many rooms. You don't need to follow every word. Just rest and drift. The night is still long, and the strangest habits are yet to come. There was a small fishing village on the North Sea coast, long gone now, swallowed by tides and time. It had no name that survived. But the people who lived there had one peculiar practice. They never slept facing the sea. They believed that the sea had eyes, that it watched the shore, that it did not like to be watched back. And so when night fell, the fishermen turned their beds toward the land or toward one another. Even the dying were turned away from the water, not out of fear, but out of courtesy, as though sleep itself demanded privacy, not only from others but from the world. This habit was not written down. It was simply understood, passed like an heirloom. And when the sea finally took the village, as it had taken so many before, people said it was because someone had looked too long into the waves during their dreams. In other places, far from oceans and tides, sleep was shared, not metaphorically, but literally. In inns, in cottages, in places with few rooms and many people, it was common for strangers to sleep side by side. 2, 4, sometimes more, fully clothed, turned to the wall, breath steaming in the dark. No names exchanged, just warmth, just presence. The practice was called bundling in some regions, though in other parts it went unnamed, because it was so ordinary that to name it would be strange. Men might sleep beside other men, women beside women, or mixed if the household permitted it and if one dreamed. The other often dreamed too, as if sleep, when shared, became contagious. There are records of travelers who swore they dreamed of places they had never seen, only to discover the person beside them had lived there once, had dreamed of it too. At the same time, what does it mean to borrow someone else's dream? No one could say. But in a world where sleep was thin and warmth was rare, such things were not questioned, only accepted, as part of the strange mathematics of the night. Elsewhere in castles and courtly chambers, sleep was an object of obsession, not for comfort, but for strategy. The nobles of some medieval courts, particularly during periods of political tension, would never sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row. They rotated rooms, kept servants guessing, moved quietly, even under silk and perfume, because poison was a fear, assassination, smothering. A noble's sleep was never fully relaxed. Some slept with dogs in the bed, trained to bark if the door creaked. Others kept mirrors by the bed, believing that the soul left the body during sleep and needed to find its way back. Still others insisted on sleepless servants, posted by the fire, stirring logs and blinking back exhaustion. These servants became nocturnal shadows, half dreaming themselves, caught between duty and the bodies pleading for rest. Their yawns were silent, their eyes red. And when they were finally allowed to sleep, it was during the day, in the stables, the cellars, or beneath staircases, where footsteps never stopped. But even in daylight, sleep was not safe, because sleep could be stolen. There were stories whispered in back kitchens and market stalls, of witches and wild women who could steal someone's sleep, bottle it like oil and use it to remain young. A child who woke tired every morning was said to be visited. An old woman who never blinked was said to be the thief. Salt on windowsills, shoes turned backwards, nails in the threshold, these were protections. Weak, perhaps, but something. And when all else failed, mothers sang, soft lullabies not meant for the child, but for the shadows. Sleep not mine, stay in the straw, take no breath, no blood, no awe. These songs were not sweet. They were warnings, and the night listened. There were bakers, too, who slept in shifts, not because they wanted to, but because bread waited for no one. Dough had to rise, ovens had to burn. The best baking happened between midnight and dawn, when air was still, and the world smelled of smoke and silence. A baker's sleep came in slivers. 30 minutes here, an hour there, always with one ear open for the hiss of steam or the snap of crust. Some bakers went years without a full night's rest. Their dreams became brittle, repetitive. A loaf that never baked, a fire that never caught, a customer who never arrived, and still they baked, because sleep might be weak. But habit was stronger. And then there were the minstrels, the traveling musicians, poets, storytellers. They slept strangely too, on moss, in hay, under tables, in cloisters and taverns and roadside shrines. But their dreams were loud, filled with melodies, with riddles, with voices they could not place. Some awoke singing, others never remembered. But the songs they sang by day often came from dreams, not stolen, not written, but heard, as if the night itself whispered tunes into their ears. And they, bleary-eyed, wrote them down with shaking hands, because to forget a dream song was a sin. You could not get it back. You could only wait for another, which might never come. In every village, there was someone who slept strangely, someone who rose at dusk and walked until dawn, someone who mumbled in a tongue no one knew, someone who did not dream at all. And these people were not ridiculed. They were watched, respected, feared, because sleep was sacred, and anyone who moved differently within it was marked, not cursed, not blessed, just different, like a candle that burns upside down. Let your breath slow now. Let the stories fade into haze. You're not meant to make sense of them. You're just meant to sink, like straw into dirt, like fog into forest, like sleep into silence. The night still holds many oddities. In the deep interiors of medieval Germany, nestled between cold hills and old pine, there was once a custom so quiet it never made the chronicles, but it lingered in memory, passed through the mouths of old women and the fingers of their daughters. It was called threading the dusk. Each evening, as the sun fell and the sky bruised purple, a family would gather by the doorway. A mother or elder, sometimes a father, though less often, would hold a long piece of thread between their fingers, sometimes red, sometimes grey, dyed from berries or soaked in soot. The thread would be knotted once for each child in the household, and then, without a word, it would be stretched across the width of the doorway. No one could pass until the knots were counted, slowly, deliberately, once and only once. Then the thread was removed, coiled and placed beneath a bowl of water at the hearth. Only then did the household sleep. No one truly knew why it began. The explanation changed from village to village. Some said it trapped the day's bad spirits outside. Others believed it marked the boundary between wakefulness and dream, a cord drawn through the hours. But no one questioned it. You simply threaded the dusk. Sleep itself was considered a kind of weaving, her stitching of the body back into safety after the fray of the day. Women spoke of it the way they spoke of spinning wool, slowly, patiently, one loop at a time. In households with many children, especially in winter when bodies lay shoulder To shoulder on the floor, this sense of weaving extended to how people physically arranged themselves. Children were arranged in alternating positions, head to toe, to prevent fighting or the accidental kicking of faces. Blankets were shared, breath mixed. The heat of 5 or 6 bodies created a cocoon of warmth that no fire could match. But sleep in these rooms wasn't always restful. The air was thick, feet stank, the old wooden beams creaked above, and sometimes so did the floorboards below. A cough would ripple through the group like wind over grass, disturbing the half-sleep that most children floated in. But it was enough, because full rest wasn't expected, only restoration, and even that was partial. Men often rose early, before the blue hour gave way to gold. Their sleep was never sacred. It was a pause, a delay before the next labor began. But women stayed longer in the warmth when they could, because they had carried the day's silence, the unsaid, the aching back, the sore hands, the quiet terrors of a child with fever, a husband too tired to speak, a neighbor gone without explanation. And when they slept, their sleep came with tasks. In some households, it was believed that a mother must dream of the next day's bread, or the dough would not rise. This belief led to odd habits, women muttering measurements to themselves as they drifted off, or sleeping with a bit of flour on their fingertips. If the flour was still there in the morning, untouched and unsmudged, it was a good sign. There were also beliefs surrounding bed positions. Sleeping with one's head toward the door was dangerous. It was said to invite wandering souls into your dreams. But sleeping with feet to the door meant you might be mistaken for a corpse, especially if covered in a dark blanket. In some villages, people placed iron keys under their pillows, not for theft prevention, but because keys being made from forged metal were believed to keep nightmares from unlocking the head. Other objects were also tucked beneath mattresses, dried lavender wrapped in cloth, a button from a loved one's shirt, even small stones warmed by fire. These were not superstitions. In the modern sense, they were instructions, inherited behaviors meant to keep the strange balance of night in order. And still, there were places where order meant nothing, places where sleep was watched. In certain lordly homes, particularly among the paranoid or powerful, it was common for a night watcher to be assigned. A servant or guard trained not only to patrol, but to listen. These watchers would memorize the breathing rhythms of their masters. They would know when a sigh meant dreaming and when it meant distress. If a dream grew too loud, murmured words, restless shifting, the watcher might gently wake the sleeper with a warm cloth or the faint sound of a bell. The watcher's job was not only to protect against assassins, but against bad omens. Master who dreamed of blood too often was believed to bring it upon the house. A lady who wept in her sleep might cause the birth of stillborns. These were not just fears, they were patterns, recorded and believed. And so, sleep became a thing to guard like a castle gate or a secret. In monasteries, sleep was timed to bells, not just to wake but to sleep. Monks and nuns were trained to fall asleep quickly with discipline. The devil enters between thought and dream, they were told. So they cleared their minds with short chants, memorized phrases, and tightly folded hands. They practiced sleeping on wooden boards, on stone, on straw with no cover. The idea was not to find comfort, but to defeat it, to conquer the body's cravings so the soul could be sharpened. In some orders, monks who fell asleep during prayers were marked with chalk and forced to eat alone. In others, they were told their dreams would be taken away. And yet, even in these strict places, stories emerged. stories of monks who wandered at night in their sleep, singing hymns with their eyes still closed, or of a nun who, when sleeping, would recite entire psalms she had never learned. No one explained it. They simply noted it in the margins of the records and moved on. And so we drift slowly into a deeper hour, where the fire has dimmed, and the walls have leaned in, where the wind outside sounds like old breath and time itself seems to curl up beside you. There are more habits to discover. Stranger ones, quieter ones. Let the rhythm continue. In the villages that clung to the mountainsides like moss to rock, there were homes where no one slept through the night, not because they were afraid, not because of wolves or bandits or curses, but because they believed sleep was not a single stretch. It was a conversation. They practiced what would one day be called segmented sleep, though to them it had no name. It was simply the way things had always been. A first sleep taken after dusk, then a waking hour or two in the middle of the night, then a second sleep until the cocks crowed. During this waking period, often between midnight and 2, the household would stir gently. No lamps were lit. Only the embers of the fire glowed, and even they were wrapped in ash to keep from flaring. Some sat quietly, hands folded. Others whispered prayers or talked softly. Not of anything urgent, just the kinds of thoughts that only rise when the world is still. Some used the time to mend clothes, some made love, some checked on the animals or looked at the stars. It was a time without pressure. A seam in the fabric of the night, loose enough to let the spirit pass through. And when the moment passed, not marked by clocks or bells, but by instinct, they returned to sleep. No fanfare, no need to explain, just a slow return to silence. This segmented sleep was common not only in the mountains, but in valleys and river towns, and even within the stone walls of small cities. It was recorded in letters, in journals, and even in court testimony, witnesses describing what they'd seen between sleeps. There was no shame in it, no concern. It was understood that night had its own rhythm. Elsewhere, across the narrow sea, in the damp regions of old Britannia, there were families who observed a different practice. Night stories. Unlike tales told at twilight, these were not meant to entertain children or send them to sleep. They were told during sleep, or rather during that same waking hour between segments. One family member, and often the eldest, would speak softly into the darkness, telling a story not to an audience, but to the room itself. A memory, perhaps. Or something half-true, half-invented. Something passed down from no one knows where. The others lay still, listening, not for meaning, but for rhythm. For the rise and fall of the voice, the pauses, the hum of words falling like slow rain. It was not the story that mattered. It was the telling. In some places, these stories were believed to keep away the night wanderers, not thieves, but spirits, said to drift through sleeping homes in search of silence. The story was a signal. This house is not empty. So even if all slept, someone always spoke, and the house listened. Further south, near the old trade roads of Iberia, people had developed, a custom that at first seemed purely decorative, embroidered pillows with symbols stitched in patterns few could decipher. These pillows were used only for sleeping, never for sitting, never for guests. Each pillow carried a different set of symbols, suns, spirals, animals, eyes, passed from mother to daughter, adjusted with each generation. They were believed to guide dreams, not control them. That was considered impossible, but steer them gently like a rudder steers a boat. One symbol might protect against drowning dreams. Another might draw forth dreams of ancestors. Another might soothe grief. The placement of the head was important, the orientation of the pillow. Even the night it was used, some embroidered with golden thread if they could afford it, others used whatever scraps they had, but all believed in the map beneath their heads. When one died, the pillow was burned, not buried, not kept, because dreams were considered personal, not sacred, but intimate. To sleep on someone else's pillow was to invite their dreams and all the memories they carried. Some monasteries collected unused pillows kept in locked cabinets. These were said to contain the last dreams of the departed. Some monks tried to interpret them. Most simply left them alone. In colder regions where snow sat like silence on rooftops and animals pressed closer to the hearth than the humans, people adopted the sleep wheel. In households too small for separate rooms, a circular sleeping arrangement was created, heads facing in, feet out, like petals around a flame. It was warmer this way, and it allowed each sleeper to be touched by the firelight. The center of the circle held the coals shielded by stones, small enough not to burn, hot enough to comfort. Babies were often placed in the exact center, swaddled tight, their faces blinking at the flicker of red and orange. Around them, mothers and aunts, brothers and sisters. Some men found it strange, others found it soothing. It was said that when all slept in a wheel, dreams spun outward, and if someone woke suddenly, the whole group would turn, like a flower toward the sun. These sleep wheels were not permanent. They were practical, but in the memory of those who slept in them, they lingered as warmth, as closeness, as something more honest than comfort, necessity. In certain ports, especially those with heavy traffic from far-off lands, sleep was layered in shifts. Sailors slept by the tides, dock workers by the bell, prostitutes by the mood of the street. Sleep was never full, it was rationed. 3 hours here, 2 there. A half hour on a chair before returning to the decks. People developed the ability to sleep, sitting up or while rocking, or even while standing in corners with their heads leaned against wood. These were not luxuries, they were adaptations, because the body bends when it must, and the mind follows. There are letters, scribbled in the margins, of ledgers and cargo manifests, where men wrote of sleeping while counting coins, of dreaming mid-step, of forgetting whether the world outside the eyelids was real. No one judged them, because sleep in these places was not a choice. It was an accident that happened when the body betrayed the will, and even then, it was brief. No one dreamed on the docks, not because they couldn't, but because dreams were too heavy to carry back. We are halfway through the veil now. The night thickens, the stories deepen. There is more to remember, but there is no rush. We move slowly, and what waits in the next? Breath is not a conclusion, only a continuation. There were places where people did not lie down to sleep at all, not because they lacked beds, but because their roles, their beliefs, or their burdens forbade such comfort. In the distant reaches of the eastern steppes, among hermits and traveling penitents, there was a practice known as vertical rest. A man or woman devoted to self-denial or seeking some form of divine stillness would sleep upright, leaning only slightly against a wall or a tree, or nothing at all. Arms folded, into robes, head resting gently forward, feet planted like stakes. To those around them this was not strange. It was a choice they believed to be less like an animal and more like a shadow. Shadows did not lie down. They waited. And in waiting, they whispered wisdom to those patient, enough to listen. In some ruined chapels and abandoned shrines, you can still find the worn stone where backs leaned for hours each night. silent, enduring, dreaming without surrender. Closer to the cities, where sleep was often a rare and broken thing, another habit emerged among the watchmen and lamplighters. They slept in pieces, not just segmented across the night, but fractured across places. 10 minutes leaning against a bell tower, 15 in the corner of a stable, an hour curled beside a lantern post. This kind of sleep left them forever tired, but somehow always just awake enough. These men, and sometimes women, lived lives between waking and sleeping. Their minds never fully clear, never fully lost. They were known for muttering riddles to themselves, speaking names no one else recognized, describing dreams they swore happened while their eyes were open. People said they walked the edges of sleep like tightropes, never falling, never flying, always balancing. Among those who served in the colder castles, cooks, laundresses, stable boys, there developed a tradition known in whispered tones as shared dreaming. It wasn't truly dreaming together, not exactly, but in households where 15 or more servants slept in the same hall, often atop hay, bundled in old cloaks or shared rags, there emerged an eerie rhythm. One person might mumble a line in their sleep, and another, minutes later, might reply with another, like a conversation continuing across unconsciousness. It was often nonsensical, sometimes beautiful. Once, in a letter from a scribe's apprentice, it was written, "The cook's boy spoke of a red tower with silver doors." A moment later, the butcher's girl whispered, "I've seen it too, but only when I'm crying." No one remembered it in the morning, but the scribe did. He recorded such events in margins. He called it the chorus of sleepers, and while no one could explain it, they all felt it, that thin golden thread connecting them in the dark. A thread not made of thought or memory, but of closeness, of breath shared, of stillness lived in together. In the highlands, where fog never quite left the ground, some villagers believed that sleep was borrowed, not owned, that every hour of rest one received had once belonged to someone else, someone who that night would remain restless. And so, to maintain the balance, each family was required to offer a waking. They would assign a person, usually a child or the elderly, to stay awake for a portion of the night, not to guard, not to pray, simply to wake, to exist, to hold the balance. This person would often sit by a window or on the threshold, wrapped in wool, sipping broth, watching stars if they could, or mist if they couldn't. Sometimes they were allowed to hum softly, to recite remembered poetry. But not to work. The night was not for doing, it was for being. They believed that if no one in a village stayed awake, someone far away, someone innocent, might fall into a sleep too deep, one they might never return from. This idea of waking as a gift shaped how they treated their night watchers. In some homes, a special bread was given to them at dawn. In others, they were blessed with the first drop of morning milk. Their waking, small and quiet, was seen as a protection cast over the world. Meanwhile, in the wealthier towns, where clocks were beginning to tick, where time was becoming measured and sleep more regimented, there were those who rebelled, not openly, not with fire or voice, but with dreams. These were the dream stylists, men and women who believed the world within sleep was as real as the waking one and could be shaped with practice. They altered their diets, fasting before bed or eating particular herbs like mugwort and sweet marjoram. They changed the positions in which they lay. Facing the east, feet touching certain stones, heads cradled in cold metal bowls. They painted images on the walls above their sleeping places, eyes, staircases, winding rivers, to guide their thoughts downward. And when they slept, they kept journals beside them, not for what they remembered, but for what they hoped to. Some claimed to speak with dead relatives. Others swore they built cities in the clouds and returned to them each night. There were no schools for this. No teachers, only shared writings, passed secretly, copied by hand, buried beneath floorboards, because in many places such practices were seen as prideful, as playing with the divine, or worse, with the forbidden. Still, the dream stylists persisted, because they believed that while the body slept in beds, the soul wandered corridors, and those corridors could be made beautiful. And then there were the sleepwalkers, the moon pullers, as they were sometimes called, children mostly, but not always, people who, when the sky went white with silver, would rise and move through homes, courtyards, fields, their eyes half closed, their mouths silent. It was said that if you watched one without speaking, they would perform strange rituals, placing stones in patterns, tracing symbols in ash, bowing to shadows. But if you spoke, they would stop, look at you, and whisper something, meant only for you. No one wrote these things down, because those who heard them, whatever they were, never wanted to remember. There's a story, old and mostly forgotten, of a boy who walked every seventh night, always to the same hill. He would dig with his hands, slowly, precisely, and though his family tried to stop him, each time he returned, the dirt undisturbed, but his fingers raw. When asked why, he said, "I'm looking for the night." And that was all. Not every habit was understandable, not every custom had a reason, but they were remembered because night was long, and memory was one of the few things that moved freely between sleep and waking. Let's stay with them just a little longer. In the rooms lit only by coals, in the silence broken only by soft turns and slow breaths, there is more yet to uncover, and no need to hurry. There was a village, not marked on many maps, where sleep was not seen as a retreat but as a pilgrimage. Nestled between wooded slopes and quiet marshland, the people of this village believed that sleep was a journey the spirit took, traveling far while the body lay still. But unlike most places where sleep was private or practical, here it was a communal event, guided, prepared, and spoken of with reverence. Before dusk, as the sun dipped behind the trees, villagers would gather in silence. Not in a church or hall, but in a clearing lined with smooth stones and flattened moss. No one spoke. The hush of the trees was the only blessing they needed. An elder, often the oldest woman, would light a single lantern and walk slowly in a circle. Behind her the others followed. Children clung to parents. Old men leaned on sticks. No one hurried. It wasn't a ritual for the gods. It was for the self. After one complete turn, each person would return home and prepare for sleep. Not by washing or prayer, but by laying down in silence. Not a word was spoken once night came. They believed that speaking in the minutes before sleep would confuse the soul, scatter its path, make its journey uncertain. And so the village fell, asleep without sound. No good nights, no sighs, only breath and stillness, as if they were waiting for something sacred to pass through. The next morning, each person would write their dreams in a shared book, not in full, just fragments, a red river, a face with no mouth walking backward through wheat. These books, known as dream braids, were never analyzed, never judged. They were simply read, passed hand to hand over tea, over fire. Villagers would nod when they recognized something, a color, a place, a feeling. It was not about interpretation. It was about belonging. Even the dreams were part of the village. In South, another part of the world, wind-swept and damp near the edge of cliffs, monks in stone cells practiced a kind of rotating sleep. There, among the shrines carved into rock and the thin pathways no wider than a man's shoulders, time was not measured by bells but by turns. Each monk took a turn sleeping, one at a time, while the others remained awake, chanting or simply breathing in silence. The sleeper lay on a stone slab, covered in a rough woolen blanket, with only a candle lit beside him. He was not to be disturbed. He was not to be watched. His dreams were considered offerings, drifting through him like smoke and rising upward through the cracks in the stone. After an hour or two, another would take his place. And so the cycle continued through, night and day never broken. Some of them, it was said, could dream with intent, sending dreams into the air like prayers shaped in fog. These dreams the others would sometimes catch, not with words, but with feelings that sat in their bones for days, quiet, unresolved, like music half heard. In towns built beside rivers, where fog curled in windows, and the sound of water never ceased, there were those who swore that the flow of the river changed their sleep, not with fear, not with danger, but with movement. People would place bowls of water beside their beds. Some would float petals or leaves on them. The idea was simple. If the water was still by morning, your soul had rested. If it had rippled, even without breeze or touch, it meant your spirit had wandered far. Children were taught to check their bowls each dawn. If the water moved, they were asked where they had gone. Most didn't remember. Some did. There are old records, scratched onto bits of bark and pasted into ledgers, where children described places they had never seen. Deserts, mountains, houses made of glass. One child spoke of walking across a bridge made of bones, into a city where every doorway hummed. He was 5. No one questioned it, because sleep was known to be a door, and children often walked through before they knew the cost. Farther inland, in villages ringed by thornbush and meadows, people prepared for sleep by listening, not to words, not to music, but to silence itself. They believed that before falling asleep, you had to listen to the world until it disappeared. Only when all outside sound faded, wind, animals, distant murmurs, did they allow themselves to close their eyes. If the silence did not come, they waited. Some sat for hours, backs against walls, watching their shadows stretch with the moon. They believed that if you fell asleep while the world still made noise, your dreams would be stained, colored by what you heard, warped by voices not your own. So silence was not absence. It was a threshold. Once passed, you were safe to drift. In colder regions, where blankets were shared and walls were thin, people developed a curious method of rhythmic sleep breathing. In small rooms where multiple family members lay beside each. They learned to sync their breathing, not perfectly, but close enough that the inhalation and exhalation formed a slow, soothing rhythm. The sound would lull them. It would calm restless minds. And it would mask the sounds outside. Wind, footsteps, hunger. The syncopation was never forced. It emerged naturally, and those who lived this way for years found that they could fall asleep faster in a room of many than in a room alone. Because, alone, they had only their own breath to follow. But with others it became a chorus, a lullaby made of lungs. Even now, in some remote homes, there are elderly women who cannot fall asleep without the sound of another's breath nearby. Not because of fear, but because for decades that was the music of their dreams. Elsewhere, in the deserts where days burned and nights froze, sleep came in layers. People did not lie down and sleep at once. They sat first, then reclined, then lay on their backs, then turned to their side. Each stage took time, because sudden sleep was believed to confuse the spirit, causing it to scatter, like sand in wind. They wrapped themselves tightly, not just against cold, but against wandering thoughts. Sleep was a descent, a ritual, and if followed correctly, it carried them not into dreams, but into memories not their own. These were not hallucinations. They were not considered magic. They were gifts. Some claimed to witness births and deaths they never lived. Some spoke of wars not as soldiers, but as weapons. One woman said she became a tree in a dream and watched 3 generations of people build a village at her roots. She awoke with dirt in her nails. No, one laughed, because in places where survival depended on knowing the wind, the stars, the scent of the earth, no dream was taken lightly. Sleep was a conversation with the unseen, and no part of it was foolish. We are deeper now, further from the waking world than ever, but there are still threads left to follow. Strange ones, soft ones, barely felt, but calling. Let's stay with them just a while longer. The night is not yet over. There was a man once, a shoemaker, who slept beneath his workbench, curled like a cat beneath the scent of leather and wax. Not because he lacked a bed, he had one, straw filled near the stove, patched with wool. But the bench, he claimed, kept his dreams quieter. The low ceiling of wood, the curve of his tools overhead, it held something still above him, something that pressed down softly on his restless mind like a second blanket. Others in the village found this odd, but shoemakers were always a little strange. They worked with the feet. After all, the part of the body furthest from heaven. They said he dreamed not of shoes, but of roads, endless roads, roads that bent and circled back on themselves, roads where no one walked, but wind left footprints in dust. And sometimes, while sleeping, he would hum, not a tune, just a vibration, like the echo of footsteps on an empty path. They began calling it the sleep hum. And years later, when he passed, another boy, unrelated, untrained, took to sleeping beneath the same bench and began humming too. Not every sleep habit came from reason. Some came from memory that did not belong to the person remembering. In monasteries built on cliffs, where storms beat at stone walls and the wind howled like beasts in pain, the monks practiced breath fasting. Before sleep they would control their breath, slow it, shallow it, hold it. They believed the fewer breaths taken before sleep, the lighter the soul would become, allowing it to drift farther, higher. They trained for months, some for years. The goal was not sleep itself. It was the letting go just before sleep. That moment where the body forgets to guard itself, where the hand unclenches, where the jaw softens. That was the door they waited at. They called it the threshold of the lantern, because they believed the soul, before floating away, left a light behind. Dim, flickering thing like a lantern at the back of the mind. You could feel it if you were very still, not warm, not cold, just present. In villages hemmed in by woods, where wolves howled but rarely came close, sleep was not allowed in full silence. It was believed that silence invited things, things that moved through gaps. So people created sleep, noise, not like the bells of temples or the chants of monks, but homemade private sounds. Dried beans in bowls, stirred with a stick. Wind chimes made of bone and string, gently moved by breath. Stone weights that clicked softly against wood. Children were taught to make these sounds before sleep, to listen to them. to focus not on dreams but on noise. Some said the sound kept the soul anchored. Others claimed it distracted whatever wandered near. But most simply found it comforting, because the night, for all its stillness, could feel too wide sometimes. Too empty. And a single sound, and even the whisper of beans in a bowl, could feel like a friend. Then there were the window sleepers, people who, regardless of weather, opened a small gap in the shutters before sleep. Not for air, not for moonlight, but for the night to look in. They believed that by opening the window even slightly, they acknowledged the presence of the world, that they weren't hiding, that sleep was not a retreat, but a pause, and that the world was welcome to watch over them. Just as they had watched it all day, some went further. They placed offerings on the windowsill, breadcrumbs, dried flowers, her drop of oil, not to appease anything, but to greet the unknown. And many said their dreams were gentler when the window was left open, as if the night appreciated being included. There's a letter, centuries old, from a girl to her sister in another village. I leave a pebble on the sill. The same one every night. If I forget I sleep poorly, I think the night misses it when it's gone. Such habits were rarely passed down formally. They slipped between generations like whispers in hallways. In certain homes, crooked ones, built over old wells, people believed in mirror covering before bed, not for superstition but for sanity. They believed the mirror held a piece of the self, and if you left it uncovered, the part of you trapped there would stare all night, restless, pulling at your dreams. So before sleep, a cloth was draped, sometimes velvet, sometimes linen, some embroidered symbols on the cloth, a closed eye, a spiral, a sleeping cat. The act of covering the mirror became part of the rhythm of sleep, not fear, just care, as if tucking in a forgotten twin. In coastal towns where gulls cried through the dark and salt laced the air, sleep came with tides. Families slept and woke not by hours, but by the ocean's rhythm. High tide meant closing eyes. Low tide meant rising. Children. Learn to feel the tug of the sea in their bones, to sense the shift, the deep inhale of the earth. Their beds were often built on rocking platforms, not to mimic ships, but to echo the sea's pulse. And when storms came and tides turned violent, sleep was different, deeper, as if the world needed them still while it raged. Those born inland rarely understood this, but coastal sleepers rarely suffered nightmares, because their dreams came in waves, not in shocks. Back in the forests, among moss-draped branches and owl feathers, there were those who practiced layered dreaming. They would wake in the night. Once, twice, sometimes 3 times, not to break sleep but to stack it. Each sleep, they said, took them deeper. The first, surface dreams. The second, memory dreams. The third, dreams of others. They kept stones beside the bed to mark each descent. Each time they woke, they moved 1 stone. By morning, all stones were lined up, and the dreamers felt hollowed out, not in exhaustion, but in cleansing. Like something had been poured from them, they were quieter people, not solemn, just deep. You could feel it in their eyes, like they were always remembering something too soft to speak aloud. We are further in now, surrounded by breath, by shadow, by moments that never sought the page. There is more still to come. No need to turn back. In the highlands, where the mist gathered like wool and the trees hunched close together as if listening, there was a belief that the mind must be emptied before sleep. Not calmed, not relaxed, emptied. This was not meditation in the way scholars would later describe it. It was more like sweeping a hearth. People would sit by a fire and tell the fire their thoughts, not out loud, but silently, staring into the coals. They believed that fire could burn thoughts, turn them to smoke, and carry them upward to dissolve. Children were taught not to carry worries into sleep. "Don't bring your sticks to bed," they'd say, a reminder that dry thoughts catch fire in dreams, and dreams built on burning sticks will never rest. Once they had emptied themselves, they would lay in beds of packed straw, often sharing warmth with animals, dogs, lambs, even chickens. Not because of lack of space, but because shared breath brought peace. They said you could feel the world sleeping around you, and that made it easier to drift. And in some places, that was the only comfort, because what lay beyond sleep, for many, was uncertain. In old cities where towers leaned and stones were worn smooth by centuries of feet, there were narrow alleys called whisper corridors. At night, people would walk these corridors before bed, slowly with one hand brushing the wall, and speak a single word aloud, not to be heard, not to echo, just to leave it behind. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a word like hunger, or sorrow, or enough. The walls took it, they believed, held it gently, and the people returned home a little lighter. It was said the corridors hummed faintly just before dawn, not with voices, but with the weight of what had been left there. They were not considered sacred, just necessary, and many slept better for it. Elsewhere, in sun-bleached towns where sand drifted into corners and the air smelled of stone and jasmine, sleep was caught in pieces. They called it fragmented dreaming. It was too hot to sleep all at once. So people napped in bursts, a short doze at mid-morning, another in the late afternoon, and then finally the deeper sleep sometime after midnight. But what made this unusual was the ritual of remembering. Each time they awoke, they recorded their dreams, not on paper, but in conversation. A family might sit silently together after a nap, sipping cool water, and share only the textures of their dreams. Not events, not plots, just images. A bird with silver eyes. Stone steps that never end. A garden full of wind. These fragments were stitched together across the day, and some said by nightfall the dreams made a kind of sense, like patchwork stories made by the unconscious mind. The oldest among them believed that sleeping all at once was like drinking a river in one gulp, too much, too fast, too forgotten. Better, they said, to sip it in parts, to savor the strangeness. There were also those who believed in protective dreaming. In mountain hamlets where winters were long and silence deep, people feared the things that walked in dreams, not spirits or monsters, but shadows of themselves, regrets, guilts, memories that hadn't softened with time. And so, before sleep, they created dream boundaries. They laid shoes at the foot of the bed, not their own, but mismatched shoes collected from those who had passed. Each pair represented a different path not taken. The idea was that the dreams would choose a shoe and walk that road, leaving the dreamer to sleep undisturbed. Some left locks of hair, some left broken tools, some left coins wrapped in cloth, all symbols of unfinished lives. They were not offerings, they were options, and in the morning, if the dreamer woke without unrest, they would thank the shoes, not with words, just a nod, as if to say, "You walked in my place." On islands where the sea was so close you could taste it in your sleep and the gulls cried like restless souls, there were the sleep weavers, women, usually elderly, who wove thin strips of fabric just before sleep, then placed them under their pillows. They believed the act of weaving tied their thoughts into knots, preventing them from unraveling into dreams. The cloths were never used. only made. And over the years they became stacks of tangled threads, frayed and faded, full of unseen burdens made harmless. Some buried them, some burned them on the full moon, some kept them in boxes, letting the weight of dozens of nights anchor them during difficult times. Because even if sleep had passed in silence, the cloths reminded them that something had been carried, and carrying even quietly was its own kind of healing. We begin to see now the quiet logic in these strange traditions, not because they made sense by today's lights, but because they did something essential. They made space for sleep, for dreams, for silence. In lives crowded by duty, fear, and repetition, sleep became the only place one could be whole. Even if only for a moment. There is still more. Let's walk slower now. There's no rush. Beneath the quiet shadows of old bridges, the kind built with worn stone and moss creeping like time itself, some towns kept a custom known as river dreaming. Not everyone practiced it, but in homes that lived within earshot of the flowing water, sleep took on a rhythm that felt more like drifting than resting. Beds were placed beside open shutters, even in winter, so the soft gurgle of current and the occasional slap of water against stone could seep into the walls. They believed dreams flowed more gently when carried by the river's voice. Children were lulled not by lullabies, but by the persistent murmur of water rolling over rock, and elders claimed they could tell the depth of someone's sleep by how far downstream their dream had drifted. A shallow dream, they'd say, stays near the mill. A deep one makes it to the reeds. Some placed a shallow bowl of river water beside the bed, letting it evaporate as they slept, believing it would draw the weariness from their bodies and leave it behind in the empty bowl. There were also those who believed that river dreams must not be interrupted. To be roused mid-drift was dangerous, they said. The dream might break apart, but not fully leave, like a net still dragging behind a boat. To wake a river dreamer too quickly, without soft light or warm hands, was to risk leaving part of them elsewhere, stuck on a bend in the dream's path, circling quietly in the water's memory. So they learned to rise gently, to stir from sleep as if wading to shore. In villages where wolves prowled the outer woods and torches were burned low to preserve oil, dreams were treated as warnings, not messages from above, but echoes of things buried. People feared bad dreams not because of demons or ghosts, but because they might point to something real, a rotting beam in the roof, a souring pot of stew, a lie someone told, sitting at the table with a forced smile. So families kept what they called dream bowls, not for water but for voice. Each morning the eldest would sit and stir the air above the bowl with their fingers, then speak a single line of their dream into it, just one. The bowl was then covered with cloth and kept on a high shelf. They were never reopened. The dream, once spoken, was considered sealed, unable to linger or twist through the day. In this way, people learned to fear silence after a nightmare. If someone did not place their dream in the bowl, it meant the dream had stayed inside, and that, more than the dream itself, was what worried them. Across the valleys, in sun-warmed cottages, thick with the scent of hay and salted pork, the sleep was different, lighter, interrupted, joyful sometimes. Because in these places families lived close, not just by proximity but by sound. Babies slept beside grandmothers, dogs curled beneath chairs, pigs snorted in pens just outside the window, and people learned to sleep through everything, or more precisely, they learned to sleep with everything. They developed the art of waking dreams, where the body rested, but the ear remained alert. Not in tension, but in attunement. They heard the clink of pans, the low whistle of wind under the door, and it became part of the dreamscape. Some even learned to incorporate the world into their sleep. "I dreamt of a bell," they'd say, after, waking to the neighbor's ox yoke clanging loose, or, "I saw a flood," after rain trickled through the crack in the roof. In this way, the world and the dream interwove, and rather than resist it, they embraced the interruptions as guides, soft tugs on the fabric of the night, reminding them they still lived within it. In the far reaches of the north, where night could stretch, like molasses over the world, sleep became a kind of shared hibernation. Whole families, even entire communities, shifted their rhythm for the darkness. They slept not in single stretches, but in sleeping seasons. The body adjusted. They moved slowly, spoke softly, ate heavily, and when they slept it was not to recover. It was to survive the stillness. They piled furs over furs, drifted into silence, and let the night pass through them like a river through stone. People would wake only for small things, to stir a pot, to add wood to the fire, to roll their joints so they didn't stiffen, and then they'd slip back into slumber. They slept in clusters, grandparents against walls, infants in hollows of arms, young men and women near the doors just in case the outside world needed keeping at bay. But sleep, this kind of deep, rolling sleep, was not feared. It was respected, even envied. Those who slept best were seen as strongest, not because of muscle but because of trust. To sleep deeply was to surrender fully, and surrender was not weakness. It was a kind of wisdom. And still, even in these slow winters, strange customs bloomed, like the chalk circle drawn beneath the beds of children, believed to be too vivid in their dreams. The circle, made at dusk and brushed away at dawn, was meant to keep their spirit from wandering too far, not because the world outside was dangerous, but because the children might not wish to return. They dreamed of things the old could not see: talking deer, green suns, water that moved backwards, and the elders, having lost that softness, feared it, feared that dreaming might become more beautiful than waking. So the chalk kept them tethered, gentle, temporary, a reminder to come home. And as we drift through these centuries of slumber and murmur, we begin to see the pattern. Sleep was not one thing. It was a place different in every village, every hearth, every mind, sometimes silent, sometimes noisy, sometimes feared, sometimes longed for, but always, always respected, because no matter how cruel the day, how hard the land, how cold the wind, sleep was the only thing that belonged to you alone, and so they learned to meet it, to greet it, to shape it, to trust it, even in the strangest ways. Far beneath the forest canopy, where the trees leaned in like curious elders, and the night sky rarely peeked through, there were quiet families who practiced what they called shadow sleeping. This wasn't sleeping in darkness. That was common enough. It was sleeping with shadows. They believed that shadows were alive and not in a fearful way. They thought shadows were the companions of those who had gone before, lingering not to haunt but to watch. So before bed, they would light a single oil lamp and sit silently, watching their shadows stretch across the wall. Children would giggle, softly, trying to wave or tilt their heads to see how the shadows responded. Elders sat still, studying the movements. They said that if your shadow moved even when you didn't, even slightly, it meant someone remembered you. It was considered a blessing. Not a ghost, not a spirit, just memory given shape. When the lamp was finally blown out, the family whispered good night not to each other but to the wall. to the shapes that faded slowly back into the wood. And then came the breathing game. This was done mostly by children, but adults joined, too, on cold nights. Once everyone was lying down, on pallets of straw, wool-stuffed mattresses if they were lucky, or plain woven mats, they would all breathe in unison. One long breath in, and one long breath out. Again and again. The room would begin to sound like a tide, rising and falling. Sometimes there were 10 voices, sometimes only 2, but the rhythm lulled everyone, not just into stillness, into togetherness. It was said that if you could breathe with someone long enough, your dreams would find each other in the dark. They didn't fear shared dreams. They welcomed them. In warmer regions where the summer bugs hummed through open shutters and the clay walls retained heat long after sunset, sleep was something chased and captured, not something that came easily. People slept with leaf bundles under their pillows, sage, rosemary, or crushed fig leaves. Not for the scent, though that helped, but because leaves were considered wind anchors. And wind, in these places, was believed to carry restlessness. Children were told, if you sleep without leaves, the wind will pull your dreams apart. Adults, too, tucked small pieces of cloth or wax-sealed paper into corners of the room, marked with small chalk symbols, circles, spirals, or a single line broken in 2. These were not letters. They weren't words. They were weights, designed to hold sleep in place, to keep it from slipping out the window or cracking like dry earth. Even water was watched carefully. Before sleep, a bowl of clean water was set near the bed, and a piece of iron, a nail, a ring, a buckle, was placed gently into it. The idea was simple. Iron grounded the soul. If you dreamt too wildly, too high, too far, the iron would pull you back. People would check the bowl in the morning. If the iron had shifted even slightly, they believed their soul had tried to wander, and if the water had ripples, they'd whisper a thank you, because it meant something had pulled them home. But the strangest sleep custom came from a town long gone, one whose name no one wrote down because they believed names were for the living. In this town, the people slept in rotation, not by time, but by dream. The first to sleep would lay down shortly after dusk. The second would wait until they heard the first person begin to murmur in dream speak. The third waited for the second to shift, and so on. It meant some didn't sleep until after midnight. But they believed that dreams moved like smoke, drifting from one sleeper to the next, and that if everyone slept at once, the dreams would become too dense, like fog, and cause confusion, illness, or waking grief. So they rotated, letting dreams pass gently from mind to mind, never overcrowding the night with too many visions at once. This made their mornings oddly quiet. Everyone felt as if they had shared something, though no one could say exactly what. They didn't speak of their dreams. They just nodded at each other over bowls of porridge, like passengers who had ridden the same silent boat through the mist. In more isolated places, single cottages nestled in valleys far from town bells and parish candles, the sleep was more like a ritual of disappearance. These people believed that sleep was a practice of dying gently each night, and waking was a resurrection. So they prepared. Before sleeping, they removed not just boots or belts, but anything that marked their place in the world. Jewelry, tokens, even names. One woman was known to go by a different name before sleep, a soft, wordless sound she whispered into the dark, to leave behind the burdens of who she was while awake. They said, "Sleep does not want your weight, only your breath." They would sleep facing the wall so dreams could only approach from behind. They thought if a dream could see your face, it might choose to stay. and take your waking with it. So they gave their backs to the dream world and trusted that they would return. They were not afraid, because for them, sleep was not an escape. It was an exchange. You gave something, time, attention, breath, and you received something in return. Maybe just silence, maybe peace, maybe a flicker of color in the mind's eye, like distant fire through thick fog. And over time, these customs, strange, forgotten, quiet, made sleep not just a pause, but a place that people visited differently depending on their language, their labor, their land, but always a place where the waking world softened, and something older, slower, more forgiving took over. Even now in the dim spaces of our own rooms, where the glow of false moons flickers on glass screens and the hum of the modern world never fully stops, echoes of these old habits remain. A pulled curtain, a quiet breath before turning, a whispered word not meant for anyone but said anyway, a dream remembered and forgotten at once. These are the remnants, the shadows of shadows. And though we no longer thread the dusk or seal our dreams in bowls, still we carry something of them, something ancient, something soft, something that lets the mind release its grip and the body finally rest. And now the breath slows, the rhythm falls still, the last candle flickers low, and sleep, wherever you are, finds you. Good night.